All right, you guys, sorry about that. Got cut off here. So, John Smith restores order. The first 30 years, the first few decades of Jamestown, marked by disease, starvation, and death, essentially. Another problem that goes along with Jamestown, you have the climate, you have the settlers themselves. The colony is built in the middle of the largest, most powerful uh, tribe in the region, the Powhatans. And so, for the Powhatan Nation, the Jamestown settlers are actually not immediately a threat to the Powhatans. They use the Jamestown settlers for trading, for goods, things that are made and manufactured in England that haven't reached the New World, or they don't have the technology to create. And so there's little fear of English colonization. It's small. The English colonizers appear weak. The English are struggling to eat. And so the Powhatans really use their position of power to trade with the English to get goods that they cannot, or they don't have access to on their own. There are some skirmishes between the Powhatans and the English, and I apologize for the typo at the bottom of this slide. It's a live show, but that there is a peace agreement that is reached in 1614 when Pocahontas is wed to John Rolfe. Again, Pocahontas did not marry John Smith. Disney lies.
John Rolfe.
John Rolfe.
Doesn't Rolfe.
No, it doesn't. Okay, so here you see a map of the Chesapeake Bay, the Chesapeake region, and you can see the Jamestown colony right there. And as it grows, this is going to be one of the major areas of the New World in which English colonization takes root. And after years of some strife and failed colonies, they are going to establish some success along the Chesapeake region. Okay, so you cannot talk about Virginia, you cannot talk about Jamestown without talking about Virginia's gold. Now, I know in the previous slide I said that there was no gold ever found in Virginia, or none of note. Virginia's gold was tobacco. So John Rolfe, again, I figure that we've already talked about, he steals the tobacco seed from the Spanish, and he is able to perfect the cultivation of tobacco. Now, there's no gold in Virginia, there's no gold in the Chesapeake region, but it is the perfect climate, the perfect soil, and the perfect area to grow tobacco. And demand for tobacco in England was incredibly high, and throughout Europe it was incredibly high. And so, as tobacco cultivation grows in the Chesapeake region, that cash crop will lead to larger and larger numbers of English coming to the Chesapeake and settling there. And as more and more colonizers come to Virginia, land is going to be in high demand. There's also going to be increased conflict with Native American tribes in the region as the English are going further and further inland in search of good land to plant tobacco. The plantation system starts to take root, and shortly we will discuss the beginnings of slavery in the New World also, which goes hand in hand with obviously plantation agriculture. In 1619, you begin to see the kind of underpinnings of democracy beginning in the New World with the House of Burgesses. The House of Burgesses is the first self-government body in the New World. Now, it is important that we don't get ahead of ourselves in this class. These aren't people calling for a revolution. These aren't people calling for any kind of independence movement. They're just, in terms of self-determination, they were trying to create a body that would decide how they would deal with the day in, day out government of running a colony. They still consider themselves British. They still are English. They still consider themselves subjects of the crown. But this was a way for them to organize and run their colony in Virginia. Okay, so again, one of the things that we want to stick with you guys, smoking is bad. But in terms of Virginia, Virginia would not have existed and would not have been as successful as it was a colony and as profitable as it was a colony for the for the English if it wasn't for tobacco and tobacco cultivation.
And yeah, just going off that, the idea of tobacco being so popular in the old world. In 1588, a man named Thomas Harriot published a brief and true report of the newfound land of Virginia, in which he described how tobacco opened all the pores and all the orifices in one's body and just made them healthy. And that the people, the Native Americans who smoked tobacco, were much better off, and they didn't get the diseases that the English did. But again, smoking is bad, and unfortunately, we're not really going to figure that out until like the 1970s.
It's going to be a while.
1980s, but yeah, very bad for you, but very lucrative. And again, it really anchored the English in the New World at Jamestown. Okay, so in order to grow tobacco, it takes hands, it takes manual labor. And as you can imagine, the people, these wealthy investors that are investing in the joint stock companies are not, putting on their boots and their straw hats and getting out there with their shovels themselves necessarily, but they're wanting to hire people. They're wanting other people to do the labor. They don't want to really have to pay people a lot of money because they don't want it to cut into their profits. And so there's a couple labor systems that really develop in response to this need for labor, and also in response to the fact that the landowners, the investors, are not wanting to do the work themselves. And so, as we mentioned, because of enclosure, because landlords in England were kicking peasants off of their land, they were building fences to grow cash crops like wool and other grains. We have a lot of people in England that are poor, a lot of people that they don't have a job, they don't have a house, they're kind of just roaming around the countryside, roaming around cities with nothing to do, and they are very attractive targets to these joint stock companies, and to basically say, hey, you don't have a job, you don't have a home, you don't have anything going for you, why not come to the New World? You can work for 5 years or so, we'll pay your way there, you go, you work for 5 years, after that your contract is over, your obligation is done, and you can get a piece of land and make something of yourselves. And so if you can imagine, that seemed very attractive to many people, and so they voluntarily signed these contracts. And this is not to say that these contracts and this work was not extremely difficult. They weren't, they were oftentimes treated poorly. They, were looked at as being, below the landlords, below the people that they signed the contract with. But what they did get was passage and kind of a promise of maybe starting them new. And so that was beneficial for the laborers. When we look at the owners, the landowners, they benefited from this head right policy, which meant that anyone that paid for someone to come from England to the New World was given 50 acres of land. And yes, people could take advantage of that if they had the money to pay their own way and they had the connections. They could take part in this head right policy and be given 50 acres once they've made it there. But the majority of people, the majority of the head right situations went to the landowners. And so we have these landowners that are just accumulating just massive amounts of land. If you're given a chunk of 50 acres at a time, that's a lot of land. If you know anything about the countryside, you can do a lot on that. And so we have these landowners that are becoming extremely wealthy. And as you can imagine, indentured servants were sometimes often, once their contract was over, they were done. They pieced out. They were done working. And so the landlords had to figure out a different labor source. And so 1619, the first year that the House of Burgesses was established, so we have people that are kind of fighting for a voice. We also have the first African slaves, about 20 slaves, are brought by a Dutch ship off the coast of Virginia and are sold into Jamestown, establishing kind of the seeds of slavery. And slavery, these slaves were treated differently than how we look at slavery today. Yes, they were owned, but sometimes they could work and pay off their masters, and they could gain their freedom. And so it's going to cut us off. So hold on